Welcome to the Sentient Media Podcast, where we meet the people who are changing the way we think about and interact with animals and the world around us. Today, we're covering a topic that's actually very close to my heart, and we're going to be speaking with an incredible person, Dr. Aysha Akhtar, and we're going to look at animal testing. So I say this is an issue that's close to my heart because it was actually an image of a kitten being tested on in a lab that I saw when I was 6 years old. And that's what sparked my journey into questioning how we treat non-human animals. In fact, I made it my mission as a kid to end animal testing. And I used to write letters to laboratories that tested on mice and rats and say, please stop doing it. I will offer myself up instead. I'm a 6-year-old. You can use me. And nobody ever took me up on the offer. And I've stopped writing to them. But anyway, at Sentient Media, we tend to focus on farmed animals. But something that not a lot of people consider is that the test subjects, the animals that are used in laboratories, are also farmed in really huge numbers, but just not for food. There's a massive industry here in animal testing, many stakeholders and beneficiaries who have it in their interest to keep animal testing very much alive, something that Aysha is very aware of as co-founder, president, and CEO of the Centre for Contemporary Sciences, which is they're pioneering the transition to replace the use of animals in experimentation with superior human-based testing methods. So a little bit more about Aysha. So a US veteran, she is a double board certified neurologist and preventative medicine specialist with a background in public health. Previously, she served as the deputy director of the US Army Traumatic Brain Injury Program, developing the Army's brain injury prevention and treatment strategies for soldiers. And as if that wasn't enough, for a decade, she was the medical officer at the Food and Drug Administration, and most recently, the Office of Counterterrorism and Emerging Threats, implementing the studies on vaccine effectiveness and safety, using top secret security clearance to develop national preparedness strategies for public health threats, which gets me giddy because of the top secretness, but I'm sure it was very serious. She's also a fellow of the Oxford Centre for Animal Ethics and author of 2 books, Our Symphony with Animals and Animals and Public Health, and has written a few pieces for Sentient Media as well. Welcome, Aysha. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much, Anna. And I have to say, you sound like you must have been such a lovely little girl.
Yeah, I don't know what happened.
No, I didn't mean that you changed, but just I love stories of kids who care and, so passionately care about what's happening to other animals that they do things like you writing those letters, offering yourself. I mean, that's so sweet.
Yeah, I guess it's something that it kind of comes more naturally to kids. Like I remember when I saw that picture and I was just like going home telling my parents, like, what are we doing to these kittens? Like, what is happening? And then you start to make that connection with what's on your plate and you're like, wait a minute, this is not okay. This is horrific. And I think if anything, we kind of train children out of that way of thinking. I mean, have you always been kind of like, what was your story? Do you have a story similar, or was it something you came to later in life?
So I've always been deeply passionate about animals. When I was a kid, I used to rescue orphan birds and injured animals. But my family, we were not vegetarians. We ate animals, and we had our 2 cats whom we absolutely loved. It was actually a story about what happened to one cow. It was a PETA magazine that we had received. We'd never heard of PETA before. We got some information in the mail from them, and we read about what happened to one cow in the process of converting her to meat, basically. And it was heartbreaking, and we had never thought about these issues. And we made the connection with our cats, and we realized there's no difference between this poor little cow and our 2 cats, and their ability to feel and their emotional capabilities, their lives. And so my family, we actually became vegetarian together, and then later vegan. And then when this was back in the late 80s, and then once I, became involved, I mean, I started reading everything about, like you, I started, kind of learning about so many ways in which we exploit animals. And that's when I learned about animal experimentation as well. And also with you, when you mentioned that was such a passion, particular issue for you, this was for me too, because I always knew in one way I was going to go into the biological sciences. I was either going to be a researcher or a doctor. I kind of already always knew that. And so when I learned about what people do to animals in the name of research, it hit me doubly, because it also felt like a betrayal to how I really looked up to anyone with a white coat. Basically, I looked up to any scientist and doctor, any researcher. And to think that people could do these things to innocent little animals really hurt me deeply. And so that then, because there have just been so few people who do focus on working on animal testing issues, it's really been the main passion of mine as well. Although I care about all the issues of animal exploitation, I've written about as many issues as I possibly can. Animal testing is one that's particularly near and dear to my heart. Ending animal testing is near and dear to my heart.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that you always wanted to be a doctor, or always like working in this space in biological sciences. Like, again, when I was a little kid, I was thinking I wanted to be a vet and look after animals. And then as I got to about 10 or 11, I realized that you have to go into an abattoir and you have to do these things that kind of help this animal suffering and be a part of kind of perpetuating that. And I believe there's this kind of, I don't know, there's almost like a bias when we look at people who enter into the medical space, because they have to go through these steps in order to, you know, test on animals or prove that they've, you know, are okay with abattoirs or whatever it is, that by the time you get to the point of running your own research lab, you've already gone through all of these hoops that have to disregard animal lives and animal sentience. Like, did you have to ever like experiment on an animal in a lab? Like, what was your kind of journey there?
So I refused to dissect frogs and fetal pigs and other animals when I was in high school. And then I tried to refuse, because I was a biology major in college, I did try to refuse to do some experimentation that was required. I almost sued my college. But the fact was, because I chose to be a biology major at the time, it was considered that we weren't going to win the lawsuit against the college, because it was my choice to become a doctor or a scientist. So I ended up having to change my major. Now I still went to medical school, but just as you said, it's kind of this sort of thing that either the more inherently compassionate people are weeded out from the scientific field earlier on, or they become desensitized as they go through the process. And the idea of experimenting on animals becomes normalized. And of course, that's the case with every industry, right? Everything that in every way in which we exploit animals, it becomes seen as normalized. And that's now, it's not only normalized, it's considered by many, not by me, by many, necessary for medical research and for progress. And so there is definitely an education kind of desensitization and acceptance of animal testing that occurs within the educational curriculum itself.
Yeah, that's right. And one thing that I really love about your work and the way that you like weave together the stories of human and non-human animals together. Like your message, it's not them and us, it's all of us together. Could you explain a little bit about how you got to that idea? Like what sparked that for you?
Yeah, well, you know, as a doctor, we were never taught to think about our relationships with animals, right? And when you think about this as a whole, we know in medicine that everything we do, every basically element in our lives can influence our health and well-being. I mean, how we eat, as we know, how we work, how we play, how we share our resources, how we relate to our environment, so on. But we never talked about in the medical field how our relationships with animals affects our well-being. And that was just so glaring. It's such a blind sight on the part of the medical field. So, you know, I started using that idea about how do our relationships with animals affect us to really explore the many facets. And that included not just the use of animals in experimentation, but factory farming, food, the wildlife trade, fur farming, and anything you can imagine. And basically, I mean, it really comes down to this. I mean, in almost every way we can imagine, when we hurt other animals, it comes back to hurt us. And so it's really important. I felt that was kind of a key role for me. A key mission was to really highlight that it's not us or the animals. It never has been. It's always us and the other animals. And I'll say other because we are animals too. And, what's good for other animals is good for us. And it's very clear. And I think that, unfortunately, is the message that may change people when the message about the animal suffering itself is not enough, right? So humans, we tend to be rather self-absorbed. And for many of us, the suffering of animals isn't enough to cause any real behavioral change. But hopefully, at least when it's highlighted that their suffering actually causes our suffering as well, then maybe that will push some people more to make some changes that they might not have otherwise.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. And I wonder, like, we definitely struggle with this notion, like, as a species, we struggle with this idea that how we treat other animals affects us too. Like, what do you think it is about us that makes us kind of struggle to to make this connection? And have you, like, it throughout your journeys and talking to people and spreading this message, have you found that most people are receptive to it? Do they kind of go, yeah, I didn't realize that all of this exploitation actually hurts us as well as the animals, other animals?
Well, there's a kind of a selection bias in this respect, because the people who come to hear my talks tend to be people who are more willing to hear what I have to say in the first case. So I don't know. I've never been, out talking to an audience that is totally naive to these issues, never thought about them in the first place. For the audience that I have talked with in front of, they seem to get it. It makes sense. I think part of the reason why this notion comes from is really getting back to the Western philosophical landscape, in a sense, that really put humans as the dominant species and above everything else. And so we've really drawn a very rigid, thick line between humans and all other animals. And so that has helped to justify, in many people's minds, just about anything we can think of doing to other animals, that, and we only think about it as how we use other animals is benefiting humans. And of course, that is a myth that's been propagated by the industries that exploit animals. So it's the myth that we need to eat other animals. It's the myth that we need to experiment on animals. It's the myth, again and again, when we think about all the different ways in which we use animals, that we need to do these things to animals, or it's better for us to do these things to animals. And so that feeds into that already Western ideological, philosophical, in cultured kind of way in which we think about ourselves as a species and every other animal on the planet.
Exactly, where the opposite is actually true, as you've proven. So let's kind of get the lay of the land as it comes to animal testing. Could you tell us a little bit, like, what is animal testing? What does it look like, and why do we do it?
So if we were to think about why it's been done, so animals have been experimented on, they've been cut open live, sometimes on the public stage live, for centuries. And the reason why we did it is because people could do it, right? And it was more acceptable to cut open a screaming dog than it was, of course, to cut open a screaming human. And so that's why we did it. Now, if we think about it, in the beginning, we can say, yes, what we saw in other animals was applicable in general to what we would find in humans, because we were looking at gross anatomy, gross physiology. And so, like, yes, the heart beats in the same general way in a dog, in a cat, and a monkey as it does in a human. But we've so moved beyond that stage now in medicine. And we're now looking at subtle nuances in biology, in neurochemistry, in genetic expression. There's so many differences between species in these areas, but that culture, that industry of animal testing remains still. And despite the fact that in so many ways, how we approach medicine has changed, but that culture of using animals, that idea of using animals to try to understand what's happening in humans remains.
Yeah, you
and
mentioned.
Yeah, sorry. No, I was going to go on and describe some of the general ways in which animals are used, if you want me to go into that now.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah. So the best, what we can figure out as far as numbers are concerned is that at more than 200 million animals are used every year, and that's probably an underestimation. And we don't really know. And the reason why we don't know is most of the countries which experiment on animals do not provide any transparency or provide very little transparency. And so the top 3 animal testing countries in the world are actually the US, Japan, and China. US is terrible in regards to transparency. The Animal Welfare Act, which is the only regulation that even applies to using animals in experimentation, excludes the majority of animals used. So the majority of animals used in experimentation are not even counted. So we really don't know how many are used, but the best estimate is at least 100 million are used every year.
I mean, yes. The mind boggles on this, because I understand that like mice and rats aren't counted as animals in this Animal Welfare Act. Like, how does that even happen? How is that possible?
That happened because whenever there was an attempt to include mice and rats, there's a heavy lobbying industry that wanted to maintain animal experimentation, that would argue that, if we had to count mice and rats because they're the majority of animals used, for example, that would be too laborious and it would drive up the cost of research and it would impede medical progress and blah, blah, blah. So they were very successful because they had a lot of dollars. So there's a lot of underhanded stories there. But even, I will say, even for the animals, and this is something people don't know, even for the few species which are covered, and those are mammals, most mammals. So the Animal Welfare Act excludes mice, rats, birds, invertebrates, non-mammals, and it excludes the use of animals used in agricultural research. Now, for those species which are covered, the Animal Welfare Act is quite pitiful. It's basically, it's a checklist approach. So if I were running a laboratory and I have monkeys or I have, dogs or cats, I have to say, yes, the cage size is a certain size. Yes, for dogs, I got to give them an opportunity to have a little bit of run each day. Yes, I provide food. Yes, I provide water. But, and here's the important thing, the Animal Welfare Act provides no limits on what can be done to animals in the name of research, no matter the amount of pain and suffering. So if I want to say that providing food is going to interfere with my study outcome, I can starve my dogs. If I want to say that providing pain relief after I burn pigs is going to interfere with my study outcomes, I can burn them alive without giving them any pain relief at all. So the Animal Welfare Act, it might as well not exist. It's quite pitiful. It truly is.
What does it do?
it gives a cover, I would say. So laboratories can say, yes, we comply with the Animal Welfare Act, even though we know so many do not even comply with those few dismal things that they have to comply with. But so, this is what the industry that holds on to defending animal experimentation will say, we have to comply with all the regulations and the animal welfare standards. So it gives them a cover when the animal welfare standards are really meaningless.
I mean, okay, so this is happening to millions of animals, on a yearly basis. if we can say that actually what comes out of these experiments saves millions of humans, then perhaps there's an argument to be made that it's, there's some suffering of a different species, to protect our species. But how effective is this testing? Like, are we getting good drugs and vaccines?
So if we were to think about the larger landscape of animals and how they're used, so I'll break it down into several categories. So one, animals are used in education. They're used to train people in surgical techniques. You don't need to do that. Surgeons are being trained in the hospital. And so you don't need to be doing these things to animals. They're still used in educational dissection, high school classes, biology classes, at universities, and so on. The second category is animals are used to test for the safety of chemicals. So these are called safety and toxicity testing. And household products and cosmetics is under this. So these, you can imagine, cause a lot of suffering because you're basically just burning their skin alive, pouring chemicals into their eyes, force feeding chemicals, to see how basically at what level does it take before the animals will die, before half of the population of the animals die. That's called the LD50, or lethal dose 50. It's terrible. It doesn't tell us anything about what the safety is going to be in humans, or what that level would be in humans. So that's what a lot of people think about when they think of animal testing, right? These are chemical, household, cosmetic testing. Now, cosmetic testing, for the most part, is not as significant of an issue anymore. And it's still, even where it is still done on animals, it's still it's a minor part. It's a small part of the overall ways in which animals are used in experimentation. Third category then is for drug and vaccine development. So this is where most people also think about how animals are used, that they're used to test for the safety and effectiveness of drugs and vaccines. This is maybe about 25% of how animals are used in experimentation. And so when people talk about life-saving treatments, this is what they think about. They think about, animals are being used to produce life-saving treatments. The truth is that, like in the United States, the Food and Drug Administration oversees, drugs and vaccines, and either approves them or doesn't approve them for use in humans. Now, with rare exception, the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, will require all drugs and vaccines to be tested on at least 2 different species before being tried in humans. But guess what? We now know that 90 to 95% of the time, the vaccines and drugs that have been tested on these animals that pass those animal tests end up failing when tried in humans. Most of them fail because they're ineffective or unsafe in humans. So we can almost say, I would say we can say, in drug and vaccine development, 90 to 95% of the animal tests fail. They do not predict what we're going to see in humans. So why do we even continue to do that? Another concern that we have is that because of that high failure rate, that lack of predictive nature of animal testing, it's very possible that life-saving treatments were actually abandoned earlier on in the progress because of results in animals that didn't apply to humans. So treatments that didn't work in animals, for example, might have worked in humans, but were abandoned early on. So we may have truly missed out on life-saving treatments. And then if I can just say one last thing, and then the last category, which is really the biggest category for how animals are used, is not drug development, is not chemical safety and toxicity testing. It's actually what's called basic research. And this is curiosity-driven research. This is research in which I, as a researcher, could capture songbirds from the wild, which one of the universities in the Northwest actually did, bring them into the lab, scramble a part of their brain to see how that affects their singing abilities. This is the type of research that's often done at academic centers and is heavily funded by our tax dollars. This is actually where most animals are used in experimentation.
I didn't know that. I probably, like a lot of people, more picture the animals that are being used for that 25% being used for the life-saving drugs. I mean, you've just laid down so many, so much information. It's a lot to take in. I guess the kind of resounding question is, well, I have two. Like, one is that number of 90 to 95% for that, for the ones being tested for drugs and vaccines, is that accepted by the scientific community?
I don't know of the whole community, but I will say it's increasingly being not accepted. And it's increasingly, and the reason why it's increasingly being non-accepted is, or the reason why I know that is because there's an increasing momentum in creating more human relevant testing methods that are based on human biology. A lot of people are aware now of that huge failure rate in vaccine and drug development based not only on animal testing, but significantly on the ineffectiveness of animal testing. And so there's been a growing momentum to move away from animal testing, at least in those areas, to replace them with better, more reliable methods. So the answer is yes. Among some segments of the scientific community, they are aware of that and they're pushing for a change. Among other segments of the scientific community, they are either not aware of it or they are not pushing for change. And I will say the Food and Drug Administration, although they're aware of that, significant failure rate, they're still very much holding on to the requirement still of every drug and vaccine has to be tested on 2 other species, because that's what they know, that's what they're used to, that's what they've always done, and that's what they continue to do.
And so the majority of the animals who are being used in these experiments are being used in, like you say, for curiosity. Why isn't that something that, why aren't we hearing that story? Like, why is that something that is kind of news to people? Why don't we talk about this? Or why isn't it part of the kind of narrative of animal testing?
It's hard. I can't tell you how many times I've tried to pitch stories, even trying to get letters to editors in mainstream media outlets, and just completely ignored. They're not interested in hearing about the scientific issues, about the counter arguments to animal testing, unless it's coming from, animal rights groups, because media loves to pitch it as animal rights groups versus scientists. It's that same old narrative, right? You care about animals or you care about humans. They've not been friendly to the idea of other scientists actually saying, hey, this is actually, animal testing is not the best way to use our dollars, to use our resources. Look at all of the animals used in what's called basic research. And it's, and so media, we can't get the message out through mainstream media. So there's social media. And I think, a lot of organizations do try to do that. But it's difficult to get this message out. It's difficult because we're talking about scientific. I mean, we're talking about science, right? And as you know, the population is kind of scientifically naive, and so there's some complexities and nuances to getting accurate information out. So in that sense, it's a little more complicated. But so the scientists who are doing these research, curiosity-driven research, of course, they will never call it curiosity-driven research. They'll, and this is what they do in their publications, like the one about the songbirds, is they'll say, oh, this study may lead one day to a cure for Alzheimer's, cure for Parkinson's disease, cure for, dementia of other forms, and so on and so on. And so they'll always tag something to their research to suggest that it may lead to treatments down the road, even though it's a bunch of bull, and we know it. And so, there's a kind of an entrenched, there's a lot of power, let's just say this, a lot of power protecting this industry.
Yeah, I mean, do you have any idea how valuable the industry is for the basic research? Like, do you know how much tax dollars goes into that?
We don't know. Again, this is another thing where we have so little transparency here in the United States. So in the United States, the National Institutes of Health is the single largest funder of biomedical research. And I guess it was about 2000, it was about 10 years ago, there was some statistic that suggested that about almost 50% of NIH's dollars went towards methods that included animal experimentation. Exactly the amount, we don't know, right? Because NIH isn't going to reveal that information. We don't know how exactly where those dollars are going. We don't know exactly how those animals are used. We don't know exactly, which animals are used and how many. There's been no indication that that number has changed. And so what that would imply is that about up to half of NIH's dollars, our tax dollars, are being used to fund NIH, which then goes to fund this type of research, is being devoted towards animal experimentation. I suspect the majority of the other half is being used to fund clinical trials, human trials, because those are very expensive to run. That's incredibly expensive to run human clinical trials. So the point is that it's not like NIH is spending 50% on animal testing and 50% on human relevant replacements of animal testing. No, it's not like that at all. They're funding most of their pre-human clinical trial testing goes towards animal research. Their funding goes towards animal research. So what that means is, so if NIH is $40 billion a year, that they get about 40 billion a year. I think that was their budget this past year. So think about half of that, going towards animal research. Now, that's just NIH. There's the Food and Drug Administration. There's the Center for Disease Control. There is the Biomedical Advanced Research Development Authorities called BARDA. There is the military. They do a lot of experiments on animals. There is the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So, and then there's charities like the Michael J. Fox Parkinson's Foundation and, American Cancer Society and so many of these other types of medical charities that people give their money to, that basically gets funneled into a lot of animal experimentation as well. So we don't know how much is spent on animal experimentation in the United States. It's a lot. That's all I can say.
Yeah. Switching gear a little bit, I don't think we've fully touched on cosmetics directly. Like thinking about testing on animals for cosmetics has always, broken my heart. Animals going through these like horrible tests for some makeup or bubble bath or whatever, and I'm not the only one. And I think that Lush, the Body Shop, other companies like that are doing a lot in that space, kind of showing the futility of testing on animals for cosmetics. Do you have any sense of if animal testing in that area has decreased in the last 15, 20 years?
Yes, animal testing definitely has decreased in regards to cosmetic testing, but there have been a couple of changes recently. One is the UK, I believe it's the UK, is now reconsidering bringing back animal testing for cosmetics, which is upsetting a lot of people. It doesn't make sense. It's an incredible step backwards. And a lot of companies have to apply with what China is asking for, because now China is a huge market for many companies. And so China requires animal testing for cosmetics. They've made some strides in the last year or so, but they still require animal testing for cosmetics. Sorry, you were going to say something?
No,
Anna?
I was just going to say that I have read that I think it is this year that they are going to remove that stipulation, I believe. But yeah, I don't know if they've achieved that.
They're removing, I haven't heard about them removing all stipulations. They're making some progress for the better, because they were even more draconian in the beginning, but now they're heading in the right direction, but they haven't, as far as I know, they're still requiring animal testing for many types of cosmetics and cosmetic ingredients.
Yeah, it's definitely nice to hear that it's been going down in that space. But yeah, obviously there's still a lot of work to do. And if the effectiveness of, animal testing for these vaccines and drugs is, 5% likely that it will be successful, then obviously there's a lot of work to be done there too. But I wonder if we could chat a little bit about the supply of these animals. Like I mentioned in the intro there, that something that a lot of people don't consider is how like in the US, you have essentially factory farms for dogs who are, beagles taken to laboratories to be tested on. Like, yeah, what's your understanding of how we, like, the supply chain, like how these animals are treated from, like, birth to when they're to death?
So yes, there are factory farm like conditions for the animals raised for laboratory use. Most animals used in laboratories now are bred for this. So that includes mice and rats and rabbits and non-human primates, and dogs and cats, pigs, and just like with every industry that sees animals as just a commodity. I mean, you assume they're being abused unless proven otherwise. And still, the end goal is to put them into a laboratory where they're going to undergo most likely very harmful experimentation. Yes, so there have been some undercover investigations specifically on factory farm-like breeding facilities for beagles. And beagles are the main type of dog used in experimentation, not because they're any closer to humans biologically, which is what people would think is why they're being used, but because beagles are being used mostly because they're very gentle and trusting creatures. So it makes it easier to manipulate them in the laboratory and easier to experiment on them. Now, non-human primates, I don't know what the number is, how many are still imported, but non-human primates are still being imported from overseas, from facilities in Southeast Asia and throughout Asia and parts of Africa. So they're still being captured from the wild there and placed in just terrible conditions and then shipped into the United States. But non-human primates are also being bred for experimentation as well.
What about when an animal has been tested on and has gone through their life, in the lab? Like, what kind of end do they get to their suffering?
It depends on the animal. It depends on the situation. For most animals, they're going to get killed, because what the researchers are going to do is they want to see what biological changes have occurred internally that resulted in the outcomes that they saw in their study. So they're going to kill them. They're going to, take them apart and try to understand some things internally. Or they'll just kill them because they've already been used for one experiment. They're tainted now. Let's say they were given an infectious disease. They're tainted. They can't be used for another type of experiment, right? So, or they're killed that way. Most of them are killed. Many of them undergo repeat experiments. They may be recycled, and this is especially the case with non-human primates and dogs, larger animals that are more expensive to house and to cover. So for researchers, they're going to want to hold on to that investment as long as possible. And I'll say investment with quotation marks. So non-human primates will undergo either chronic long-term experiments or repeated experiments of one sort or another. So they can undergo a lot. All of these animals undergo so much pain and suffering. A few, and this is very rarely, there have been in some cases where some animals, after they have been used to a certain degree, will be adopted out. And so you'll hear about some organizations that help facilitate that. That's like a drop in the bucket, though, the number of animals that get adopted out.
Do you think is the research space and kind of scientific community, you say that there is changes and there are strides towards to non-animal testing, but do you feel like you're like an outlier? Is what you're doing accepted by the groups that are still continuing to do animal testing? Do you feel there's a good reception towards your methods?
I think I would say that I have a greater reception now than I would have 10 years ago, without a doubt. I've been fighting animal experimentation for more than 30 years now. And for the first time, I actually have hope. And I really do, because there is a change happening within the scientific community. We're not at the tipping point yet, but it is growing. And there have been new methodologies that have been created, so much more human relevant testing methods based on human biology, right? Not the biology of a dog or a cat or a monkey or a rat, but on humans. And that's what makes sense. So so now we, as at the Center for Contemporary Sciences, we're finding a lot more people who are willing or open to really talking and partnering with us. But also, I think maybe there's a selection bias there, because I'm not interested in anyone who is going to stand in our way. If they're going to be holdouts on maintaining the status quo, I'm not even going to try to work with them, try to convince them, try to change them. It's a waste of my time. It's a waste of our resources. It's a waste of the resources that donors have, put their trust in giving to us. And so we really focus on working with those who want to make the change, who are willing to work together to make that change.
Yeah, you're blazing a trail, and they can catch up.
That's the idea. Yeah.
I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about your Center for Contemporary Sciences. Why did you establish this yourself instead of joining with, an existing organization? What's driving you there?
Is this going to sound arrogant that I have my vision? I have my vision for how I want to see things done. Listen, I mean, the thing is that, we have so many organizations who've been working on these issues. They have so much money. And the fact is they haven't changed the system. And so, I can try to work within those organizations, but I'm going to be beholden to how they want to do things. And I wanted to give a chance to see if my vision will work. So I co-founded the Center for Contemporary Sciences, and we launched just about a year and a half ago. I know that sounds arrogant, but what has been tried hasn't really worked so well. It's worked in cosmetic testing, but again, that's a very small number of animals in comparison, in the overall picture of how many animals are used in experimentation overall. So this is a chance to really see if we can try some different approaches, some different ways, and in a sense, kind of start fresh. So the Center for Contemporary Sciences, I mean, our predominant approach is really to work on the scientific ways to replace animal testing. And so what we do is we partner with many organizations, academic institutions, and others to really provide more education on what these other newer methods can do, to change policy to allow for more of these new methods to be used at the FDA, and to one day we're going to work on changing NIH's funding policy so that more of their funding goes towards the development of newer, better methods that will replace animal testing. And so we've got some different approaches that I think are a bit unique. And this is really about moving the needle really towards developing, creating, improving, and using more effective methods that are really going to make this a win-win for humans and animals. And so it's our goal is really to create this ecosystem, with a larger ecosystem that fosters this change in science, fosters the change in funding, fosters the change in policy, all to kind of elevate and increase the use and discovery of better methods of testing.
Yeah, I don't think it's arrogant at all for you to say that you needed to set that up. I think it's super necessary, incredibly important work that you're doing, and it doesn't exist out there. So you're doing the exactly the right thing. I wonder, we don't have like too long left, but I wonder if you could explain a little bit. You mentioned doing superior human-based testing methods. What exactly is a superior human-based testing method? Could you give us a bit of insider info?
Yeah, so one that a lot of people are, will probably hear about, are what's called organ-on-a-chip technology. And that was sort of, I guess, discovered, created around 10 to 15 years ago. And it's now really taking hold. A lot of academic institutions, Prince Charles, I think, just funded a major endeavor in the UK now on this technology. So it's really garnering a lot of enthusiasm. It needs more funding, though, and there's always room for improvement, without a doubt, but it needs more funding. But basically you're capturing human tissues, and you're distilling. How do I say? You capture human tissues onto a little microchip. That's why it's called human organ on a chip, and you're creating three-dimensional structures of an organ that captures a significant component of an organ. So for example, if I were to create human lung on a chip, a human lung on a chip actually can breathe like a real human lung. I mean, it's a component of a human lung on a chip. There's a human kidney on a chip, a heart on a chip, a brain on a chip, mini brain, and so on.
Are these like physical things, or is this like a computer program?
No, these are physical entities, and they're combined often with artificial intelligence, or what people are calling smart machine learning or something. I'm probably butchering the terminology. But these are physical chips, and they're human tissues that are grown. The reason why they're so exciting is because they're a step up from the traditional, what's called in vitro testing methods that were of the older days in a sense. And not that those still don't have a place, but these three-dimensional chips are three-dimensional as opposed to two-dimensional constructs. So they're much more faithful to the actual human organ. So now there's human bodies on a chip now. Now you can kind of pretty much connect multitudes of many different human organs, and through a system that in which you can see how a drug works through many of these organs, and so on. Now this is just one kind of method. There's also many human organs grown in the lab now. I suspect we're going to get to the point where we can actually grow full human organs in the lab. That will be what we use for transplants, which would be good news for pigs, which are used a lot now for human organ transplants. One of the things, besides the fact that these are human tissues, and this is human biology, the other wonderful things about some of this technology is that we can actually, at some point, we're going to get to the point where we can conduct clinical trials, human clinical trials in the lab. Meaning, one day, Anna, there's going to be an Anna version of a human organ on a chip, and an Aysha version of a human organ on a chip, and someone that represents the 50-year-old white Caucasian, the white male, like my husband, someone who represents an elderly Pakistani female, like my mom, someone who represents a young boy in South Africa, right? Because we know there's so many differences even within our human population. So we can capture tissues from a diverse population, and we will be able to one day run actual clinical trials in the lab before we get to live humans, before we get to that final stage. And so that's going to significantly improve the drug development process, make it so much safer for people to enroll in clinical trials. And then on top of that, we're also going to embark on an era of what's called personalized medicine. So Anna, let's say if I were to get breast cancer tomorrow, a drug that might have worked for someone else for their breast cancer may not necessarily work for me, or may not necessarily be safe for me. So there's going to be a point when my tissues in these types of organ systems and other types of methodologies can be screened against the drug. So researchers and clinicians will one day get to a point to see if a drug or vaccine is going to work in my biology. So that's going to be personalized medicine. And when you think about that, where does a rat have a role in this? When we're getting to that kind of fine detail, where we're now seeing that what may be safe in you and effective in you may not be safe and effective in me. How does even a rat play a role in that equation? So this is some of the wonderful things that are coming out that these new technologies can do, because they are based on human biology.
I mean, that's definitely a future that sounds incredible. It also sounds expensive at this stage. Is what you're doing in your center, is it something that's scalable? Is it something that labs are actually going to be able to use based on their current, finances?
Yeah, so I just want to say we don't create these technologies as an organization. So we help create an ecosystem basically that furthers these technologies and allows for their greater use. But some of this personalized medicine is actually already being done on a smaller scale with some companies, with some countries, but it hasn't reached, a large scale endeavor. And that's probably something that's going to happen more within, let's say, 20 years, next 20 years. And when we get to that point, but like everything, it's always more costly in the beginning. And then once you get the process down and you can scale things much more easily, and then you educate scientists and doctors on how to use these things, and then it becomes the default. And that's where we're heading.
This might be a totally incorrect assumption, but you know how like cultured meat, cell-based meat is made? Is that like a similar process to how we're creating these like organs?
Well, I will say, I don't know exactly all the process behind the cultured meat, but I will say that the basic technology came out from the medical research side, because it was the need to create these three-dimensional structures, human biological structures in the lab, that is facilitating the development of cultured meat.
Oh, it makes a lot of sense. Amazing. Okay, so I want to just kind of bring this back to an article that you wrote for us in June this year about a new bill that you were writing that could phase out animal testing for good. Could you just shed a little bit of light on that bill, and perhaps if you know what the status is now?
Was that the FDA Modernization Act, or was that a different one? Okay, the FDA Modernization Act. Okay, yes. So I'm very proud. In only 14 years, we were the scientific lead behind this new bill. It's called the FDA Modernization Act of 2021. And it was just recently introduced into the Senate in October. I was at the press event, and it was great to see the senators very excited about this new bill. So it's a bipartisan bill. Cory Booker on the Democratic is the Democratic lead. Rand Paul is a Republican lead, and there's a lot of it's funny to try to get Republicans and Democrats who have such opposing views on so many things to get along on this, but they did. But basically, what this bill does is that it goes back to an original statute that was created in 1938, which basically set up what the FDA is today. And in that 1938 statute, because animal testing was all that was known at the time, it required all drugs to be tested on animals. And so what we've done is we've gone back to that statute and just changed the word animal to non-clinical. Non-clinical means in this case, non-human. So basically what that means is that it just allows, if it passes, this bill will allow for the use of other types of testing methods. It doesn't take away animal testing, because if we tried to do that right now, it will never pass. But it starts to pave the way for more and more drug companies to start using like organ-on-a-chip technology and other arguably more effective methods that are based on human biology.
So awesome. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Very quick follow-up question that I forgot to ask before about the organ-on-a-chip and these kind of tests. Are they, I know the answer, but are they more effective? If the animal laboratory tests are 90 to 95% ineffective, are these human centered ones, are they what's their success rate? Do we know?
We don't know, because there haven't been any real significant studies yet, and they're not being used in place of animal testing currently, because the regulatory the policies don't allow these testing methods to be used in place of animal testing. It's weird, right? Because so when I was at the FDA, I remember my office funded the development of some organ-on-a-chip technology, because we knew the animal testing was problematic. So we funded some organ-on-a-chip technology, but guess what? The developers had to validate their method against the animal testing. It didn't make, the animal testing was so problematic in the first place. Why are you validating something against something that's already bad? I mean, isn't the point, shouldn't it be validated against what we're going to expect to find in humans? And so it's a completely messed up way in which the regulatory agencies are getting about this. But what I will say is, how can you be worse than 90 to 95% failure rate? So it can only get better. So the studies are starting to come out, and there have been enough studies, at least, that show that there have been enough studies that show that oftentimes the organ-on-chip technology have found safety problems that the animal tests did not, or they were able to show effectiveness that the animal tests did not, effectiveness in humans that the animal tests did not. But there hasn't been any systematic evaluation because the data is still too new, and there isn't enough yet. But that's something that we're starting to compile so that we can have that information on our website.
Yeah, that's really cool. And okay, finally, if it's our tax dollars, that are going towards supporting this kind of industry, the animal testing industry, like, what can we as individuals do to help mitigate that? How can we change our behavior, or what can we do to make it better?
So much of it is our tax dollars, and that the government's really the biggest single funder of animal experimentation. So if you stay tuned, follow us on our social media. We're going to be hosting some ways that you can contact or send a letter to your senator or congressperson to let them know that you want them to pass the FDA Modernization Act. So please follow us. We're kind of working on some website changes so that template will be up at some point, so people can directly contact their representative. That's one thing you can do. You can follow us, share social media posts that we put out, educate people. People just don't know about these issues. Please do so. And then the other thing is, I know it's a bit of a work. I do recognize this when you write to write to your congressperson and to find out, where to send a letter or something. I think there are some easily accessible platforms now online where you can find out who your representative is if you don't know, and how to contact that person, if their email, and just send them a quick email if you can, and just say, please do what you can to put less governmental funding into animal experimentation. You can just put that note, that little one quick liner. They're not going to care about this long message. They don't want to read a long message. All they want to know is, how do you vote? Yes for animal testing, no for animal testing. That's basically it. That's what they're going to calculate. And so the more emails or phone calls they get like this, the more they see that the public cares about these issues.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time today. It's been really enlightening. I've definitely learned a lot from you, as I always do when I listen to you or read your work. It's been a pleasure to talk with you today.
Thank you so much, Anna. I'm always so grateful to be able to talk about these issues. As we talked about earlier, not many media sources will want to talk about these issues. And that's a crime in so many respects. So I'm really grateful to Sentient Media to doing this.